So we welcome to the podcast for episode 98, Dr. Stephen Farnsworth. And let's go ahead and do a quick bio for you guys who don't know. He is professor and director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at University of Mary Washington. He is specialist in American government, the presidency, media, and politics. Recently wrote Late Night with Trump, Political Humor, and the American Presidency, numerous awards, all-around fantastic person and Virginia political extraordinaire. And that's why he's on the program today. Dr. Farnsworth, thanks so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
And so pretty interesting night, to say the least. We have had all three by fairly close margins. The gubernatorial race was the largest margin, 70,000. But Republicans took all three statewide seats, and they also won 7 seats in the House of Delegates to regain their majorities in the House. So, if folks are only going to watch the first couple minutes of this podcast, what is your key takeaway?
Well, I think it's very clear now that we live in very partisan times. The voters have made it very clear that they're not going to be taking one from column A and one from column B. Most every voter is voting up and down the line, all Democratic or all Republican, and that's very bad news for compromise, for centrist politics, for any kind of dynamic, for any politician to run in a district where they're just not favored.
Yeah, for sure. That I think kind of boils it down in a nutshell. I think a lot of folks thought that Virginia was demographically turning into a blue state. I think, though, that even though I do agree with you that there is a lot of vote straight down the ballot kind of thing going on there, you do see, though, Virginia as probably more of a swing state and a lot of it to be issue dominated. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think it's, a lot of people over the last several years have talked about Virginia being a blue state, but I think it's increasingly clear that what Virginia is, above all, is a purple state that just didn't think that much of Donald Trump. When you are looking at the results over the last several years, you see that Democrats really benefited a great deal from emphasizing Trump, from focusing on Trump in their campaigns. But that message really fell flat now that Trump's an ex-president. And so what you see is sort of a reversion to the mean, to the purple state status that Virginia often has. We've had a lot of close races, right? I mean, even if you go back to 2014, the last big election before the Trump era, that was a narrow win for Senator Mark Warner. That race, like the race that we're looking at now, under 2 percentage points or so. And so that creates a very, very powerful dynamic, I think, for Virginia as you think about it statewide. It's a state that's probably going to be getting a lot more attention again from presidential candidates if we're thinking ahead to 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of attention from presidential candidates, but also a lot of attention up on Capitol Hill. I don't know how much time you've had today, but I certainly had the TV on in the background, and I know that they nationalized this race, within the last few months, and they certainly haven't stopped nationalizing this race. They're talking now. I think I heard Kevin McCarthy for the House of Representatives saying that any Democrat who had a 16-point advantage, in their last race now needs to be considered a competitive seat. I don't know if politics has changed that much, but do you have any thoughts on that? Were the margins just really that much anti-Trump in 2020?
Well, I think part of it, too, has to do with the specific factors here in Virginia. I think Glenn Youngkin was a very effective candidate. I think the Youngkin campaign had a clear vision of how to secure a victory. And that involved keeping an arm's length from Donald Trump. It involved connecting those two very disparate parts of the Republican Party, the people who are really all in on Trump, but also the people who might have voted in the past for Romney or McCain, but didn't think much of President Trump. And that's a challenging thing. And for a first-time politician to really sort of navigate those difficult waters, I think really speaks to how effective Youngkin was as a candidate. I'm not so sure, though, that that's necessarily a message that can be replicated around the country. I mean, some things clearly can. I think you can talk about education and parental control of schools in a lot of places and have success with that. But when you're thinking about the Youngkin campaign in particular, the Republican Party of Virginia went out of its way to make sure that the most pro-Trump possibilities did not become the nominee. And I'm not so sure that other state Republican parties around the country are going to be as indulgent, as willing to allow that kind of latitude for Republican candidates for office who are not willing to fully, totally, wholly embrace Donald Trump. Virginia's Republican Party was very tired of losing, and they made sure that they put forward a candidate who had maximum appeal to Republicans who weren't entirely in the Donald Trump camp.
So there is a AP News report out there regarding the top issues, and what they're reporting is that 35% of Virginia voters said it was the economy and jobs was the most important issue facing the state, while 17% said COVID-19, and then 15% the big education issue. There was a lot of conversation, at least I thought, coming from the Republican camp on those issues, while at the same time we heard a steady drumbeat coming from the McAuliffe camp regarding trying to associate Youngkin with Donald Trump. Do you think that the McAuliffe campaign overemphasized the last president?
Well, I think they absolutely did. I think that the Democrats were in some ways fighting the last war, but Donald Trump was no longer president. I think that McAuliffe needed to do more to get people convinced about reasons they should vote for him, not just why they should vote against the other guy. I think that is sometimes a real problem in politics. As contentious and combative as politics can be sometimes, there sometimes can be this great dynamic, this great focus on the issue of how awful the other side is. That negative partisanship can really work. It can really help with elections, but it's not necessarily going to be the whole package. It's not going to necessarily get you across the finish line. As we saw, I think if we're looking back in retrospect at this election in Virginia, McAuliffe really needed to talk more about the things that he would do and the things that he would bring to bear. I mean, after all, McAuliffe left office with relatively high approval ratings.
Absolutely.
He could have talked about his years in office. Northam still has relatively high approval ratings, even despite the very rocky 4 years that have been involved with Northam's time in office. And so you put those two Democratic terms together, those 8 years, and there are positive things that one could say about them. And that they did not make more of an effort to say those positive things strikes me as a mistake.
Do you see the last few months with the Biden administration trending to negative? I think his latest approval rating in Virginia is like a 53% disapproval of Biden. Do you see what happened in Afghanistan and the rising fuel prices and the concern about, not, breaking out of COVID-19 and solving the problems with the virus? Did Biden play a factor in this election?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I think that, if you look at the list that you mentioned, and I would add the congressional Democrats to the list as well, there were a lot of headwinds that a Democratic candidate is facing in November of 2021 that are national in scope. I think that being president often involves making tough decisions, and it often involves successes, but it also involves failures. And that's true for every president. But I do think that in terms of sort of where in that first year of the Biden presidency this election was, this was a difficult time. There's a run of sort of bad news, difficult environment in the weeks and months leading up to the first week of November. But to me, I think more important than Biden was just this narrative that the Democrats can't govern. I think that the Republicans could use that very effectively in a lot of places, and the ammunition for that argument was provided by the Democrats themselves as they dither on Capitol Hill about these various funding programs. Right. A lot of Democratic activists who helped create this Democratic majority said, well, what are we getting for our trouble? And if you look particularly at the exit polls in Virginia, you see this being reflected, particularly among African American voters and voters under 30, people who were very Democratic in their loyalties as a group, but also kind of frustrated, I think, that more change hasn't happened. Now, those of us who study politics or pay attention to it regularly, we know that many plans fall apart pretty quickly when presidents have to deal with competing priorities, or they have to deal with unexpected crises, or they just have to deal with Congress that doesn't see the world the way they do. Any of these things can derail a presidential agenda, and of course, in the case of COVID and the frustrations that people have with schools and jobs and the economy, with respect to the difficult situation in Afghanistan, it was never going to look good getting out of there. Somebody was going to take the hit in their presidency, and Biden was the one who ended up, I guess, with the hot potato, so to speak. The reality is that it always is easier to play defense than offense in politics. It's always easier to complain about the other side, to blame the other party, to find fault with what the person doing the job of being president or governor is doing, than to actually do the job yourself. I think that there's an old saying that people campaign in poetry and govern in prose.
So let's look at that a little bit. How important do you think it was for Youngkin actually not to have any name recognition or political experience over, the decades of knowledge that we have about Terry McAuliffe, and the fact that he was trying to do something that, at least in my lifetime paying attention to Virginia politics, had never been done before, and that's run for re-election, absent a term.
Yeah, I think what you saw with Glenn Youngkin was a campaign that really benefited from the fact that he didn't have a political history. He hadn't cast a lot of votes like a member of Congress would, that people would find fault with. He hadn't spoken a lot on public issues through the years that people would find fault with. I mean, if Youngkin had been in Congress, for example, he would have had to take a stand on the January 6th question. Was this a legitimate electoral college vote in Arizona or Pennsylvania or Georgia? Whatever those kinds of things you do can make you enemies. And so, he didn't have to do that. He could simply talk about the general idea of voter integrity as an issue, which is enough to convince a lot of Republicans that Youngkin gets their concern. But it's not so explicit as a vote to decertify the electors of Arizona or something, where you're really having to make that decision. It's not like a vote on whether or not to impeach the president. Those kinds of things really get in the way, I think.
For sure.
Being a new, fresh face. And, one of the things that we know about politics is people are often drawn to those people without records. I mean, in a way, it's sort of counterintuitive. I mean, I'm not sure that I'd want to go to a doctor who has never seen a patient before.
Sure.
But we in American politics often turn to politicians who have had very little experience in elected office before they get appointed to something.
The good news about Youngkin, though, is he was a CEO, and this is a chief executive position as well. He just hasn't, run a state.
Right. But, there are plenty of people in business who, make this transition to politics and they don't do well at it. We have no idea how well he's going to do at it because we have nothing to look back on. We can't say, well, we saw from a Senate career or a career in Congress or as a big city mayor or anything like that. All of these kinds of things can give us a much clearer sense of what we're going to get. But sometimes in politics, it's better to be less defined rather than more defined. And I think that really did work to Youngkin's advantage this time around.
Let's talk about the big issue that, of course, everyone's talking about, and that is the gaffe that I guess you would say that Terry McAuliffe had at the debate, where he said that parents don't belong, having a say in their children's education. I know you as a professor probably have an opinion on this yourself. But instead of, putting you on the spot, let's talk about the politics of this. It's like asking you if the sky is blue. Yes, we know that it had a major effect on this election, but talk to me about why it had an effect. Who did it reach out to?
Well, I think the effectiveness of this issue was compounded by the choices that McAuliffe made more than the choices that Youngkin made. The best debate for candidate is one that is totally forgettable. But with the second debate, when Terry McAuliffe made that comment about parents not having a say in education, it was that sentence that launched 1,000 campaign ads. And the painful reality for the McAuliffe campaign was that they didn't respond to this effectively. You can always say, "Oh, I misspoke. Here's what I really meant." You could always say, "Well, I'm going to respond to this in a different way. Here's another issue on education." And I think that the McAuliffe campaign underestimated the extent to which that gaffe was going to animate a lot of voters. And why this issue was effective is because it allowed people to take any one of a number of issues of their frustrations with public education and then think about it in that context. Like, some people might be worried about security in the schools. Other people might be worried about mask mandates. Still others are worried about critical race theory. And still others are worried about any one of a number of other issues, whether
Sure.
the teachers are teaching to the test too much or whatever it might be. There's always a great deal of how can I put it? There's immense expectations on public education in this country. We're supposed to fix everything, those of us who are teachers. And that's particularly true when you're talking about K to 12. I mean, I think by the time they get to college, most of my students are already secure. They're going to be successful. They have the skills, they have the capacity to do well. But particularly when you're talking about, little kids in the elementary grades, teachers have an immense impact. And the expectation is that schools can fix all the things that happen for the hours that those students are not in the classroom. And when you think about COVID and you think about how much time and how challenging it was for these teachers, it was frustrating for the parents. I mean, Parents didn't necessarily want their kids around the house all day when they're also trying to work from home. The question about all of these matters of education concern, they all sort of boil down to one thing, and that's an angry constituent. And that's a mechanism, I think, that can be very effective because, you want to get motivated voters. You want to get people engaged because that's what you get them to turn out, because this isn't a presidential election where you're going to have immense turnout. It's going to be a gubernatorial race where the turnout's going to be significantly lower. And so if you can figure out some way to get people energized on your side, why then you're in great shape. And that's what that issue was. It was a great opportunity, and it was handed to him on a silver platter.
And I was honestly very surprised by the McAuliffe response, so much so that before it even happened, I kind of rolled my eyes and said, well, of course, parents need to be involved in their child's education, but also we need to understand that we have professionals who are part of the education process, and they have studied how to educate and deliver information to students. And so it's a partnership. And at the same time, I think to myself, like, well, of course, as a citizen, I should have a say in how, transportation is run or how sewer and water is run. Of course, I can have a voice in that. So I'm really surprised that Governor McAuliffe did not kind of respond that way in kind in the weeks afterwards, because I honestly didn't think it was going to be a winning issue for the Republicans, but he didn't do that, and sure enough, that's where we are today. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to talk about the critical race theory thing, and you focus on media. I have heard a lot of narrative beginning that this was basically the rise up of white suburban voters against race being taught in the schools. I find that personally laughable, but talk about that narrative that's starting to develop. And do you see that as having any legs for the people who are saying it? I think it's weird considering the fact that we have a black woman elected as lieutenant governor and a Latino American elected as attorney general. If race was such an issue with white voters, I'm sure they would not have won. But your thoughts?
Well, a party ID trumps everything, in my view, in terms of politics. And so I think it's important to remember that people care much more about an R after your name or a D after a name than whether you're you look one way or you belong to one ethnic group or whatever the case may be. So I really do think that when we think about elections and politics, we really can more or less start and end with the question of party. Critical race theory can, be this scary thing to some voters. Absolutely. Remember, Virginia's undergone immense change on questions of race in recent years. I mean, if we'd had this conversation 5 years ago and you'd asked me how long would the Robert E. Lee statue stay atop Monument Avenue, I would have said, how long are we going to live? How long,
Right.
It would not have seemed like something that was about to happen to me. Okay. And I pay a lot of attention to what, is going on in Virginia public opinion. And so, we are always looking at the unexpected in these sorts of things. But certainly for people who are very concerned about the way the conservative vision of the Civil War, the Southern narrative of the Civil War is being adjusted and changed. Certainly for some of those people, it's going to be a personal matter. And so there is going to be these kinds of tensions and pressures that are going to be out there as different people look at, at a contentious time in the past, and it's a contentious time in the present. I think ultimately it was an effective issue, even though critical race theory, of course, is not being taught as a K-12 curriculum matter in Virginia public schools. But it's still something that can sort of allow you to sort of a basket in which you can place some of your fears or your anxieties or your anger at the way that racial matters are going in this country and deal with that electorally. I think sometimes, in the same way I talked about how it's sometimes useful for a politician not to be too well defined. Sometimes it also works to one's advantage that the issue that one's talking about is also not that well defined, because then people can read into it what they want, and you don't have to sort of narrow it down or define it in a precise way. You get maximum impact with that latitude of interpretation, I think, from voters.
Absolutely. Couple quick things. Don't have to have a long commentary on it, but it is interesting to note that there were 16 House races that ended up like over $1 or $2 million spent or the like. I looked at the VPAP website. Most of those candidacies that outspent were on the Democratic side. Yet they ended up losing, of course, the majority in the House. And then on that same realm, you like talking about demographics. I know that's one of the issues that you focus on. Again, it's sort of that golden crescent of the DC suburbs, Richmond, and then here in Hampton Roads. That's where we saw a majority of these House seats flip. There was one out in Roanoke area as well. So does money really matter all that much in politics? I know it helps. And then again, is it still the importance of the suburbs and turning out your vote in those areas?
Well, really, the tide goes in and the tide goes out, And so what happens in terms of these larger macro issues at the state level, the gubernatorial candidate level, really is going to matter a lot more than what you put in your flyer. I lived in one of those close districts, the 28th district, where a Democratic incumbent was defeated in the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, or Fredericksburg, Stafford area. Yeah. And it was the same basic story. A well-funded Democratic candidate. Remember, most of the money is going to go to the party that's in the majority. That's how it worked when Republicans were in the majority too. But it didn't really turn the needle in his direction. There was a problem for the Democratic Party across the ballot, and being able to raise $1 million didn't necessarily save you if you were in a district that wasn't that was competitive.
Yeah. So Dr. Stevens Farnsworth, really appreciate you being on the show. Where can folks follow you? I know you have a pretty active Twitter feed.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. That's probably as good a place as any.
Awesome.
And of course, there reporters do call sometimes, so I have a chance to be in the media here and there. So.
That's awesome. What are your final thoughts regarding this race before we move on to the General Assembly session? And they're already campaigning for 2022.
Well, the thing is, we don't even know how long this governor has a Republican majority in the House of Delegates. We may very well end up having another round of House of Delegate elections next year because of the delay with the census and the redistricting. True. One of the courts have previously ordered 3 elections in 3 years in a situation like this. And if they do it again, well, we'll have this conversation in another year and the outcome may be very different.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Farnsworth, don't be a stranger. Hopefully we have a chance to connect soon. And if that happens, if we have re-elections, I'll definitely be giving you a call.
Thank you. Have a good one.
And my thanks again to Dr. Stephen Farnsworth for joining us to talk about the Virginia election and its ramifications. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you liked it too. If you did, please like it, subscribe to it, and of course, tell others. That's the way this show will grow, is by word of mouth. That's the most important thing. So hopefully you'll let your family and friends know all about it and come back for future episodes. And if you haven't seen some episodes, I've got 97 of them behind me. So check it out. There's lots of really good conversations about policy, about politics, about communication, about leadership. And we will continue to try to produce as many of these good shows as possible. As long as you're interested, I'm certainly interested as well. And so until next time, I am J.R. Heck.